From the moment we were reborn, Norman and I seemed to instinctively understand the unspoken agreement: stay away from each other. Our previous life had been a tangled mess of resentment and regret, culminating in a final, violent confrontation. As we lay dying, our last words were laced with such bitterness that the fervent hope of never crossing paths again in any future existence felt like a desperate plea to the universe. He blamed me for the stifling weight of marriage and children, for the dreams of Beijing and a singing career that slipped through his fingers. I, in turn, seethed at his constant absence, his indulgence in a life outside our home, while I shouldered the responsibility of his ailing parents and our two children. In the crowded street of this new life, our eyes met briefly, a flicker of recognition passing between us. But without a moment's hesitation, we both turned away, each walking in opposite directions. A silent promise hung in the air. This time, let us both find a path free from the crushing weight of our shared past. The day I decided to alter my university application, my father entered my study. He glanced at the computer screen, a small nod of approval gracing his lips. "That's good," he said, his voice firm. "With your excellent grades, you should aim for a prestigious university. Stop wasting your time chasing after that boy from the Lee family. What could you possibly see in him?" My mother, hearing the murmur of voices from the kitchen, hurried into the room, gently pulling my father away with a warning look. I watched their retreating figures, a faint smile touching my lips, but a sudden tightness constricted my throat. In the life I remembered, I had rushed out late one night, desperate to find Norman at the train station. My parents, consumed with worry, had followed me, only to be struck by a drunk driver. I never had the chance to say goodbye. Swallowing the rising tears, I moved the mouse, my finger pressing the confirm button with a newfound resolve. The application was changed. In our shared history, Norman, who had been a constant presence since childhood, abruptly announced his ambition to become a singer and journeyed to Beijing to pursue this dream. Yet, not long before, his fervent declarations revolved around our future together, attending the same university, a dream he claimed was his deepest desire. To help him realize this aspiration, I had willingly sacrificed my own chances of attending a top-tier institution, using my high test scores to apply to the same less-regarded school he had chosen. But a mere 2 days before the university acceptance letters were due to arrive, his announcement about Beijing shattered our carefully laid plans. That very night, Mr. and Mrs. Lee knocked on our door, their faces etched with worry as they implored me to help find their son. In the previous timeline, I'd gone. My parents, their concern for me unwavering, had followed, leading to the tragic car accident. I did find Norman, and Mr. and Mrs. Lee, overcome with grief and a sense of responsibility, had declared that he was to blame for my parents' deaths and therefore obligated to compensate me. Their solution was swift and decisive. Norman and I were to become engaged and marry immediately after graduation. By then, I was already pregnant, a second-year college student forced to withdraw from my studies. The wedding was a hurried affair, a formality overshadowed by my growing belly. I gave birth, and the initial years of motherhood passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless care. A longing to return to my education gnawed at me, but fate had other plans. My in-laws fell gravely ill and came to live with us, seeking treatment. Norman, with a tone of forced reasonableness, insisted that we had a duty to care for them, citing their sacrifices in putting him through school. He, of course, would work and provide for the family. In those early days, out of a misguided sense of pride for Norman, I never voiced the stark reality that his meager earnings were woefully insufficient to cover the children's needs and our household expenses. Eventually, I was compelled to sell the house in my hometown, the only significant asset my parents had left me, to pay for my in-laws' mounting medical bills and the ever-increasing costs of raising two young children. While I relinquished my academic aspirations and toiled tirelessly to keep our burgeoning family afloat, Norman squandered his small salary on evenings out with friends, clinging to the fading hope of his singing career. The relentless pressure of our financial and familial obligations suffocated me. After countless attempts to bridge the growing chasm between us, our conversations devolved into bitter arguments. He accused me of being harsh and narrow-minded, claiming that I had single-handedly derailed his path to stardom in Beijing. He even went so far as to suggest that I had used my parents' tragic death to manipulate him into marriage. I, in turn, did not hold back, dismissing his singing aspirations as a ludicrous fantasy for someone with his vocal limitations. The mention of my parents' death sent me spiraling into a rage. I lunged at him, desperate to silence his hurtful words, but he shoved me away with a force that left me reeling. From that moment on, Norman began to deliberately absent himself from our home. His parents, who had previously shown little interest in our lives, now placed the entire blame squarely on my shoulders, labeling me as unreasonable, narrow-minded, and solely responsible for my husband's unhappiness. They conveniently forgot their tearful pleas for me to find their runaway son years ago. In that decaying existence, I gritted my teeth, tightening my belt, and taking on any odd job I could find to support our family. Yet, the children I poured my heart and soul into raising never truly connected with me. They always gravitated towards Norman, who remained perpetually detached and carefree. I clung to the hope that, as they matured, they would eventually understand the sacrifices I had made. I waited over 2 decades until they were married and had families of their own. But instead of offering me companionship in my later years, they vied for Norman to live with them, treating me with a cold indifference. "Mom," they would say, their voices tinged with resentment, "you controlled us too much when we were younger. We don't want to hear any more lectures." "Dad's dreams were crushed because of you," another would add. "Now that he's older, we want to take him to Beijing and help him chase his dream." Even my grandchildren echoed this sentiment. "Grandpa and Grandma are right. You just want everyone to live the way you plan. You're selfish." Their words were like shards of glass piercing my heart. Returning home, utterly heartbroken, I found Norman packing his bags, boasting with a smug satisfaction that he was finally leaving me to pursue a better life. After dedicating over 20 years to managing our family, all I was left with was the bitter label of a selfish, controlling woman. Why was Norman so unburdened? He had shirked his familial responsibilities, yet in the end, he was the enlightened father in my children's eyes. In a surge of despair and anger, I rushed at Norman and pushed him. He froze for a moment, then his hand lashed out, grabbing a nearby vase and hurling it at me. "You dare lay a hand on me? I'll kill you." And so, our deaths were not a sudden accident, but the culmination of years of mutual resentment and a final, violent clash. In the moment we both fell, a silent prayer escaped my lips. "If there is a next life, please let me never meet Norman again." The day I was reborn was the very same day I was scheduled to finalize my university application. Looking at my parents, still vibrant and alive beside me, I made a firm, unwavering decision. I would not involve myself in anything related to Norman. After the grueling college entrance examinations, a flurry of celebratory gatherings ensued. My closest friends and I had just concluded one such get-together when I noticed Norman in the distance, his laughter echoing as he chatted with a group of his friends. "I heard Norman isn't going to university," one of my friends remarked. "He's going to Beijing to become a singer." "Wow," another exclaimed. "Isn't that the trendy Beijing drifter thing now? If he actually makes it big, should we get some signed photos in advance? They might be worth something someday." "April," a friend nudged me, a knowing look in her eyes. "You and Norman grew up together, right? You must know about his plan to go to Beijing." I casually glanced across the crowd, and as if drawn by some unseen force, Norman turned his head, our eyes meeting briefly. In that fleeting instant, I knew with a chilling certainty, Norman was reborn too. "I don't know," I said, my voice deliberately nonchalant. "I have something I need to take care of. I'm heading home." Without a second thought, I turned and walked away. If he wanted to go to Beijing, then let him. His life had absolutely nothing to do with mine anymore. As the day of Norman's planned departure drew nearer, I feigned a sudden wave of homesickness, telling my parents how much I missed my grandmother and the newly hatched ducklings at her house. My parents, who had always indulged my whims, readily agreed to take me. As we were preparing to leave, Mrs. Lee opened her front door, and seeing us with our bags, she paused. "Going out?" she asked, a hint of curiosity in her voice. My father nodded cheerfully. "The kid wants to visit her grandma. We'll be gone for a few days." Mrs. Lee smiled and nodded. watching us as we walked towards our car. I pretended to be indifferent, but my fists clenched tightly, concealing the anger that simmered beneath the surface. How utterly ridiculous I had been in my past life, genuinely believing in Mrs. Lee's sincerity. It was now painfully clear that her intentions had been far from pure from the very beginning. She had coveted our house for a long time, which explained her relentless efforts to push me into marrying Norman after my parents' death. In my grief-stricken state, Mrs. Lee's seemingly kind and gentle demeanor had lulled me into a false sense of security. Because I also harbored feelings for Norman, I had readily agreed to their plans. I had been so blind, never suspecting the calculated scheme that had been unfolding all along. I took a deep breath, suppressing the slight tremor that accompanied my anger, and forced a smile as I chatted with my parents about the new pony my grandmother had acquired. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw Norman hurrying away, a suitcase in hand. He must have realized I was reborn too, and his impulsive plan to run away and chase his unrealistic dream had been hastily moved forward. We arrived at my grandmother's house and were enjoying a peaceful dinner when my mother's phone rang. It was Mrs. Lee. Norman is insisting on going to Beijing to become a singer and isn't going to school anymore, she wailed, her voice laced with desperation. We can't persuade him, no matter what we say. Could you have April come back and talk to him? After all, they've always been close, and Norman always listens to April. The words were exactly the same as in my previous life. My mother looked at me, her brow furrowed with concern. After all, we were in the countryside, and returning home was no simple matter. I calmly placed my chopsticks down and took the phone from her hand. Mrs. Lee, I said firmly, my voice leaving no room for argument. This is Norman's decision. I can't interfere. Even if I did, he would just resent me. I think you should respect his choice. Without hesitation, I hung up and blocked her number. My swift, decisive actions left both my parents stunned. My grandmother was the first to break the silence, urging them to continue eating. She wisely reminded them that other people's affairs were their own karma and we should not interfere. I felt a surge of gratitude for her understanding. After dinner, I sat in the yard, gently stroking the soft fur of a small dog while my parents came to join me. April, my mother began hesitantly, her eyes filled with concern. What's been going on with you lately? You just don't seem like yourself. My father remained silent, but his worried gaze mirrored my mother's. Their concern tugged at my heart, and I wiped away the unexpected tears that welled up in my eyes. Mom, Dad, I said softly, I need to tell you something. I had a dream. I lied, framing it as a vivid nightmare, and recounted everything that had transpired in my previous life. When I described how I had been manipulated by the Life family after their deaths, my father's face darkened with fury. They had always trusted me implicitly, especially since I explained that everything had begun with Norman's sudden decision to go to Beijing and Mrs. Lee's subsequent plea for my help. They finally understood my sudden insistence on visiting my grandmother and my refusal to go after Norman. My dear, my mother whispered, tears streaming down her face as she pulled me into a tight embrace, comforting me with all her love. My father, standing beside us, lit a cigarette, his expression resolute. If April dreamed this, he declared, maybe it means the Lee family is our family's nemesis. I've made up my mind, we're moving. We're going to get as far away from them as possible. I had never anticipated such unwavering support from my parents. My nose tingled again, and I nodded through my tears, hugging my mother even tighter, feeling the warmth and security of her embrace. We stayed in the countryside for nearly half a month, and I returned home with a slight tan. My grandmother insisted on packing our car with an abundance of food for our journey back. Before we could finalize our move, we still had to spend a few days in our old house. As we arrived, Mrs. Lee from across the street quickly opened her door. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, but beneath the surface, a lingering resentment flickered in her gaze. Why aren't you answering my calls? Mrs. Lee demanded, her face contorting with anger. Why won't you come back and help me find Norman? Her voice rose to a shout, startling my parents, who clearly hadn't expected such agitation. I, however, simply stared at her with a cold indifference. After being her daughter-in-law for over 20 years, I knew better than anyone her talent for manipulative theatrics and twisting the truth. My mother, unable to contain herself any longer, was about to respond, but I gently tugged at her sleeve. "Let's go inside," I murmured. "There's no need to engage." Mom wrapped her arm protectively around me, glaring fiercely at Mrs. Lee, but still couldn't resist a parting shot. "You can't even manage your own son, and you expect April to help? What kind of son is that? You've got the wrong person, I'm telling you." Once inside, Dad immediately began contacting friends, arranging appointments to view houses that afternoon. If everything went smoothly, we might even be able to move the very next day. Mom and I sat on the couch, and she absent-mindedly ran her fingers through my hair. "It's okay," she murmured soothingly. "It's okay. We'll stay far away from them. Very soon, we'll be far away." I nestled into her arms, softly echoing, "Mm-hmm." The process of house hunting and moving unfolded more swiftly than I had anticipated. Even quicker than that, my university acceptance letter arrived. This time without Norman, without the tragic car accident. I happily went to the school to collect it. When I returned home, my parents were still engaged in a lively discussion about how much pocket money they should give me. We laughed together, our hearts overflowing with a joy that words could barely express. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I would still dream of the past life, the endless struggle to hold our family together with my meager earnings, the constant blame from my in-laws, the painful misunderstandings with my children, and the relentless bickering with Norman. Those years had been a heavy burden, but thankfully this time, I was starting fresh, unencumbered by the ghosts of what had been. School began soon after. Standing on campus that first day, I felt a sense of lightness and anticipation. My parents, too, were visibly pleased with my decision to change my application. In my previous life, at this very time, I had just buried my parents and was walking in a daze alongside Norman towards a second-tier university on the outskirts of the city. When people inquired about our relationship, Norman would invariably distance himself, offering an awkward, forced smile and stating that we were merely classmates, despite our impending engagement. I shook my head, pushing those unwanted memories aside. I accompanied my parents to the registration office to complete the necessary formalities. A new school, a new beginning. After my parents reluctantly bid me farewell, I quickly adapted to my new surroundings. Everything around me felt precious, a second chance I was determined not to waste. In my past life, my studies had been abruptly halted by the demands of motherhood and family responsibilities. Now, I finally had the opportunity to continue my education, and I was happier than I could ever have imagined. During the winter break, I returned home, proudly presenting my scholarship and the money I had earned from writing articles, thoughtful gifts in hand for my parents. Their smiles were radiant, their eyes crinkling at the corners as they praised me for being their cherished child. That evening, they prepared a lavish dinner together. As we sat around the table, our conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and shared stories, until my mother casually mentioned that she had seen Mrs. Lee a couple of days prior. She and her husband, Mr. Lee, were at the market selling vegetables, Mom said with a sigh. After they both lost their jobs, they've been living off government assistance, which is barely enough to get by. She paused, a hint of pity in her voice. I heard Norman signed with a company in Beijing. The training fees are several thousand a month, not including food and lodging. If he makes it, that's one thing. But if he doesn't... I lowered my head, picking at my food, but inwardly, a mocking laugh bubbled up. Norman wouldn't succeed, and it wasn't a curse. It was simply the truth. Norman was the kind of person who couldn't resist boasting. As soon as he had signed with some dubious company, he had plastered it all over social media. But in his eagerness to brag about his big break, he hadn't even bothered to properly vet the company. Moonlight Entertainment, it was called, a small, fraudulent operation that had been exposed in my previous life. Their business model revolved around recruiting aspiring trainees, charging exorbitant fees for lessons, and then essentially selling them off to other unscrupulous, unregulated entities. Those poor trainees found themselves in a terrible predicament. They would pay tens of thousands for supposed performance opportunities that never materialized, and they learned absolutely nothing of value. In the end, they were simply sent from one den of wolves to another. I had heard that only one trainee had managed to escape that cycle of exploitation, and that individual came from an incredibly wealthy family who had to pay millions in termination fees to regain their freedom. Norman, of course, had no idea about any of this because at that time, he was completely consumed by his new college life, joining every club imaginable and living in a state of blissful ignorance, having completely forgotten the grand dream he had so vehemently insisted on pursuing. And those nostalgic thoughts about his singing aspirations only seemed to resurface whenever he and I would argue, conveniently blaming me for his lack of success. Mom didn't dwell on the topic. She was an inherently optimistic person and quickly found another amusing anecdote to share with Dad, and soon they were both laughing heartily. I smiled, listening to their familiar banter, the corners of my eyes crinkling with genuine amusement. After we had moved, I genuinely believed I would never have to see the Lee family again. But unexpectedly, the very next day, as I was on my way to meet a friend and happened to be walking past a small convenience store, Mrs. Lee appeared as if from nowhere and grabbed my arm. She looked significantly more haggard than I remembered. Her eyes were sunken, her lips were dry and cracked, and she emanated a palpable aura of ill health. My friend hadn't arrived yet, and upon realizing I was alone, a strained smile stretched across Mrs. Lee's face. She tightened her grip on my arm and launched into a torrent of complaints, mostly centered around our abrupt departure without a word and how her precious son was in Beijing for his rigorous training and wouldn't even be able to come home for the upcoming New Year. Mrs. Lee, I said, firmly but politely withdrawing my arm from her grasp. Excuse me, but I really must go. I'm quite busy. Her reaction clearly indicated surprise at my cold and distant demeanor. After a moment of stunned silence, she regained her composure, blocking my path and speaking in a tone of wounded reproach. April, why are you being so unreasonable? I've already let go of the fact that you didn't answer any of my calls, and now you're acting so incredibly disrespectful. Mrs. Lee then visibly softened her stance, smoothing down her hair and adopting a more coaxing tone. I know, she said, her voice dripping with a false sweetness. You've always had a soft spot for Norman. Now that he's in Beijing, working so hard to become a big star, if you still want to be with him, it's not entirely impossible, you know. I simply looked at her, and the rapid calculation that flickered in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She was up to something, as always. I heard you've moved into a much bigger house, she continued, her voice becoming more conspiratorial. I bet the old house hasn't been sold yet, has it? Here's the thing. Just give me the keys, and I'll happily help you keep an eye on it, do some cleaning every now and then. For the new year, if you're not planning on being home, you can always come and stay with us. Norman will know that someone is looking after the place, and he'll feel much more at ease. Mrs. Lee continued, outlining her opportunistic plan with blatant disregard for my intelligence. Once she had the keys to my old house, she could easily rent it out and pocket the extra income. And if I were to spend the new year at her house, it would not only serve as a convenient way for her to subtly show my parents that I wasn't afraid of them anymore, but she would also gain a free live-in nanny and a readily available ATM for the entire holiday season. How could I possibly not see through her transparent scheme? I simply smiled, offering an easy agreement. All right, Mrs. Lee, I said, my voice deliberately cheerful. You just wait for me to get back to you. I'll talk to my parents about it. Don't worry about buying anything for the new year. I'll take care of absolutely everything when I come over. Mrs. Lee was visibly overjoyed, showering me with insincere compliments before reluctantly allowing me to leave. I patted the spot on my arm where she had gripped me, a silent sneer playing on my lips, and then turned and walked away, my earlier amusement completely evaporated. This new year, I actually had a genuinely good time, surrounded by my loving parents in our new home. As for Norman's parents, I had a strong feeling their holiday season wouldn't be quite as pleasant. Of course, I never gave them the keys to our old house, nor did I bring any of the promised food. During the New Year festivities, it's notoriously difficult to purchase anything, especially essential items like fresh vegetables, fruits, rice, and noodles. And even if you could find them, the prices would have more than doubled due to the high demand. Now that they also had the added financial burden of supporting a son chasing a pipe dream in Beijing, they certainly couldn't afford to splurge on overpriced groceries. I didn't bother to conceal the fact that I had deliberately misled Mr. and Mrs. Lee. I directly told my dad about Mrs. Lee's continued attempts to manipulate me into becoming their family's unpaid caregiver. My dad was absolutely furious that I hadn't taken even greater advantage of the situation. "Shameless!" he exclaimed, his face flushed with indignation. "What do they think they're doing? Trying to get my university-educated daughter to wait hand and foot on those two old geezers?" Dad glared, his voice rising. "If they cause you any more trouble, I'll personally deal with them. What a load of utter nonsense." I couldn't help but laugh at my dad's fierce protectiveness and blatant bias, feeling a warm, fuzzy feeling bubble up inside me. But what I hadn't anticipated was that before the New Year celebrations had even concluded, Norman came back. And not only did he return, but he brought a girl with him. I happened to run into Norman and this girl on the street one afternoon, and the two of them were practically glued together, whispering sweet nothings and giggling like teenagers. When Norman suddenly spotted me, his immediate, almost panicked reaction was to push the girl away from him. She stumbled slightly, her expression instantly clouding over with annoyance. "Norman!" she exclaimed, her voice sharp. "What's wrong with you? You practically begged me to come back here with you, and now you're pushing me away?" Norman was instantly flustered, his cheeks flushing a deep red. He hurriedly tried to placate the girl, murmuring apologies and reaching for her hand. But he couldn't help but steal a nervous glance in my direction. Perhaps the 2 decades of our tumultuous marriage had ingrained in him a subconscious habit of constantly scanning for any perceived signs of my disapproval or betrayal. Even though we were no longer together, those old reflexes hadn't completely disappeared. I briefly looked at him, and then my gaze drifted to the girl standing beside him. There was something vaguely familiar about her features. After a moment of contemplation, it finally clicked. A wave of understanding washed over me, and suddenly, so many things from my previous life made perfect sense. I finally understood why, despite everything seemingly going well between us, Norman had abruptly decided to pursue his singing ambitions in Beijing. I understood why, despite being in what I believed was a committed relationship with me, Norman had stopped reminiscing about our shared past and our plans for the future. I also finally understood the root of the intense hatred the later Norman had harbored towards me. I couldn't suppress the sudden, involuntary laughter that escaped my lips. When my mocking gaze met Norman's bewildered and slightly panicked stare, I silently cursed under my breath and turned on my heel, walking away without a moment's hesitation. The girl's name was Ondine. She had briefly transferred to our class during our senior year of high school. She was young, undeniably beautiful, and possessed a vibrant energy that set her apart from the other girls in our class, who were mostly focused on their studies and future careers. In fact, during the short time Undine was with us, she had quickly become the unattainable white moonlight in the eyes of almost every boy in our grade. I hadn't realized until now that Norman had also fallen under her spell. I vividly remembered one day during a sudden classroom power outage, Norman had casually started singing a popular song by the soft glow of candlelight. Ondine had been effusive in her praise, showering him with compliments and declaring that his talent was so extraordinary that he could easily become a famous singer in Beijing. Ondine, as it turned out, was originally from Beijing, and at that time, for us living in our relatively small town, the word Beijing carried an almost mythical weight, representing a distant and seemingly unreachable world of opportunity and excitement. Looking back now, everything fell into place with a sickening clarity. After Ondine had transferred to another school, Norman's attitude towards me had subtly but noticeably shifted. He began to criticize me for what he perceived as my lack of femininity, often comparing me unfavorably to Ondine's supposed grace and charm. He told me I was too focused on academics and lacked a desire to explore the wider world. He even commented on my clothing choices, suggesting that I didn't know how to dress and had somehow missed out on the best years of being a young woman. A bitter laugh escaped me at the memory. At the time, in my naivete, I had actually believed he was offering constructive criticism, genuinely trying to help me become a better version of myself. Now, I realized it wasn't that at all. It was simply that he couldn't find any trace of Ondine's captivating qualities in me, and unable to confront his own feelings of inadequacy and longing, he had resorted to nitpicking and finding fault with everything I did. Even when we finally got married, a cold and distant expression seemed permanently etched on his face. After we had completed the official registration, he had turned to me with a strange look in his eyes and asked, his voice devoid of any warmth, "Are you happy now?" It was as if I had somehow forced him into this commitment, coerced him into a life he didn't truly desire. He couldn't even acknowledge his own desires and choices, yet in the end, he wanted me to bear the full weight of the consequences. This, I now understood, was simply Norman's characteristic way of dealing with problems. Deflect, blame, and avoid taking any personal responsibility. I have no idea exactly how Norman managed to reconnect with Ondine after he moved to Beijing, but I do know that the Li family experienced a rather dramatic and eventful year. I had heard through the neighborhood grapevine that when Ondine finally arrived at the Lee family's modest home in our small town, it took less than half an hour for her to storm out in a fit of rage. Norman, ever the devoted follower of his white moonlight, immediately abandoned his bewildered parents and followed Ondine as she left, going straight back to Beijing with her without even a word of explanation or apology to his family. My mother, being the naturally curious and somewhat gossipy person she was, had secretly enlisted the help of a mutual acquaintance to inquire about the specifics of that disastrous encounter. It turned out that Mrs. Lee, upon first laying eyes on the glamorous Ondine, had immediately attempted to lay down some rather strict ground rules for her behavior and expectations within their household. However, Ondine was clearly not someone to be easily intimidated. She had sharply retorted to Mrs. Lee's demands, and the argument had escalated so quickly that Ondine had reportedly even flipped over the greasy dining table in the Lees' cramped living room before dramatically storming out of the house. My parents thoroughly enjoyed hearing about the Lee family's public embarrassment and happily sent me back to university after the winter break, repeatedly reminding me to focus solely on my studies and not to give those people another moment of my precious time or energy. In my spare time at university, I began to dedicate myself more seriously to my writing, utilizing the knowledge and insights gained from my previous life and working somewhat under the radar. I had already completed 3 full-length novels, each exceeding 1,000,000 words. The financial compensation I received for my work was more than generous, providing me with a comfortable level of independence. It was around this time that Norman suddenly added me as a friend on social media. I initially rejected his request several times, but he proved to be incredibly persistent, creating new accounts in an attempt to reach me. Eventually, out of sheer exasperation and a morbid sense of curiosity, I had no choice but to accept his latest friend request. Once we were connected, Norman barely exchanged any meaningful words with me, offering only a few superficial pleasantries before launching into a litany of complaints about how incredibly difficult life had been for him since his move to Beijing. He lamented the sheer number of people also chasing similar dreams, emphasizing his own less than ideal circumstances. Apparently, his primary assets in navigating the cutthroat entertainment industry were his smooth-talking abilities and his reasonably attractive appearance, which he claimed had initially helped him capture Ondine's attention. However, after finally winning the affections of the high-class and elegant Ondine he had once so idealized, the reality of their relationship seemed to have shattered his carefully constructed fantasy. After a brief period of intense infatuation, Norman's true nature began to assert itself, and he soon started making demands on Ondine, expecting her to cater to his needs and desires. But Ondine was nothing like me. For her, even entering into a relationship with someone like Norman had likely been a significant step down socially, so there was absolutely no way she was going to assume the role of his caretaker and provider in the way I had so readily done in our previous life. Unsurprisingly, Norman was quickly dumped by Ondine, and shortly thereafter, his fledgling management company went bankrupt, leaving him in an even more precarious situation. I had Norman's messages set to Do Not Disturb, but occasionally I would glance at the notifications. I couldn't help but stifle a laugh when I saw his latest self-pitying updates. I'm so incredibly unlucky, always getting involved with these terrible companies. I have to practice singing for 14 hours a day. If I were still in school, how much happier I would be. Another one read, Ugh, all the women in Beijing are so materialistic. I'm not famous yet, but I will be. So why won't they even go out for a drink with me? Then there was, I switched to a new company, but it's really not much better. If I had only known, I would have never come to this godforsaken city. And finally, Beijing really isn't as great as everyone makes it out to be. The people here aren't even half as genuine as the people back in our small town. Yes, the people in our small town are indeed genuine, which is precisely why the Lee family had so readily taken advantage of that very quality to exploit me in my previous life, treating me like their personal servant. From beginning to end, I had been the ultimate fool. The truth, as I now understood it, was that no matter what path Norman had chosen, he would have inevitably found something to regret, because he never truly possessed the drive, the dedication, or the genuine talent to achieve any real success. He was accustomed to having things arranged for him, and whenever reality failed to align with his expectations, he would invariably resort to blaming others. He harbored the naive belief that if he had only made a different choice, everything would have magically fallen into place. People often tend to idealize alternative paths, and Norman was a prime example of this phenomenon. Selfish, cowardly, utterly lacking in responsibility, and remarkably adept at running away from his problems. That was the essence of Norman. His so-called grand dreams, which he had once proclaimed with such dramatic flair, turned out to be just as ordinary and ultimately unfulfilling once he actually experienced them for himself. Once this realization fully solidified within me, I blocked Norman on all social media platforms and even went so far as to change all of my contact information and online accounts. Someone like him belonged firmly in the past, left to wallow in the consequences of his own choices. But I never, in my wildest imaginings, would have predicted that after losing all contact with me, Norman would actually come to Beijing in a desperate attempt to find me. In my second year of university, having earned a significant amount of money from my writing, I decided to leverage my memories from my past life and establish a small media company. I specifically sought out and signed several up-and-coming new media influencers who, for various reasons, hadn't quite achieved mainstream popularity in my previous timeline. I began to strategically guide their content creation and overall online presence. Soon enough, their accounts started to gain significant traction, attracting a steady stream of collaborations and, more importantly, lucrative advertising deals. I found myself juggling the demands of my studies with the ever-increasing responsibilities of my burgeoning company. Eventually, as my business thrived, I brought my parents to Beijing and bought them a comfortable house. They were absolutely overjoyed, constantly boasting to their friends about their daughter's unexpected success and spending hours scrolling through short video platforms, enthusiastically trying to identify more potential influencers for me to sign. One day, immediately after finishing a particularly challenging exam, I hurried out of the school gates, eager to get to an important company meeting. As soon as I stepped off campus, I was suddenly enveloped in a tight hug from behind, the person clinging to me with surprising force and refusing to let go. "Wife?" a familiar voice whispered in my ear, sending a shiver of unpleasant recognition down my spine. "I finally found you." I gasped in shock at the sound of that voice, but I managed to swallow my initial surprise and revulsion. After forcefully pushing the person away, I turned to see none other than Norman standing before me. He was wearing a cheap, worn-out leather jacket, and his face was smeared with the remnants of what looked like poorly applied, low-quality makeup. His teeth, slightly yellowed, were visible in the forced, unsettling grin he offered, making my stomach churn. And yet, despite his disheveled appearance, this was indeed Norman, now heavily doused in an overpowering synthetic perfume. He made another clumsy attempt to hug me, but I quickly sidestepped him, creating a safe distance between us. "I know you've reincarnated too, wife," Norman rambled on, his eyes darting nervously around. "You have no idea how incredibly hard it's been." All right, hold up a sec. So, there I was, right? Fresh out of an exam, feeling good, ready to tackle my company meeting, and bam! Freaking Norman, can you believe it? He's all, "Wife, I finally found you." Like I'm some lost puppy he's been searching for. Dude was even wearing this ancient leather jacket and had cheap makeup smeared all over his face. And those teeth? Yikes, talk about yellow. He tries to hug me again, and I'm like, "Nope, not today, Satan." I sidestep him so fast I almost gave myself whiplash. "I know you've reincarnated too, wife," he drones on. "You don't know how hard it's been without you." Oh, I'm sure it's been so tough for him. Poor Norman. He keeps rambling, and within like 2 seconds, I get the whole picture. Thanks to Mrs. Lee's big mouth, he found out I'd started my own media company. And guess what? He tracked down the accounts of the influencers I manage. Suddenly, I'm a small but wealthy businesswoman. So instead of chasing his pathetic dreams in Beijing, his genius plan is to get back with me. He blocks my way, trying to look all emotional. Wife, even though we've reincarnated, we can still start over. Don't you remember? We have two lovely children. In our past life, the six of us were so happy together. Oh, please. I stare at his performance, and I can't help but roll my eyes so hard they almost pop out of my head. Big brother, I say, dripping with sarcasm. Please wake up. Have you forgotten why we reincarnated? His face changes, and he starts looking around like he's about to get busted. I don't want to repeat the mess of our past life, I tell him, but I'm just glad that in this life, I've finally escaped from you. I take a breath, and the disgust is practically oozing out of me. You always use the excuse that I ruined your dreams and trapped you with marriage, then come to blame and abuse me, even pushing everything onto the kids. I point a finger at him. Norman, let me ask you, what happened to your singer dream? What happened to your glorious days of fame? Why haven't you brought your mother, the empress of your life, to Beijing yet? Oh, wait. I shake my head at him, and it's almost comical how pathetic he looks. This life, your mother's still sick and helping you make money for your dreams, right? I heard you even sold the house to buy an electric guitar. Do you get it now, Norman? His face turns ugly and his eyes get all mean. He grabs my arm, and I swear I almost decked him right there. April, what are you so proud of? No matter what you do, you were still the woman I slept with and the one who raised my kids for over 20 years. You think you can escape just because of reincarnation? Norman's creepy gaze is all over me, and he sneers. You've got some fame now. If I were to tell people about your birthmarks, your sensitive spots, you were always a slut. Let's see if your company will still thrive. Oh, he did not just go there. Go ahead and say it, I say, yanking my arm away and looking at him with pure disdain. You always try to use the most shameful tactics to get what you want, Norman. Can't you do something to make people respect you? I call the doorman and tell him Norman isn't a student at our school. He gets dragged away, and I take the chance to grab a taxi and get the heck out of there. The first thing I do when I get back to the company is call one of the lesser-known influencers and spend the afternoon talking to her in my office. A short video skit goes viral online. The main story is about a young girl who, at the request of her neighbor, goes to the train station in the middle of the night to find the man she likes. But while her parents, worried about her, chase after her, they get into a car accident. The girl's neighbor takes advantage of the situation, getting rid of the girl's other relatives and persuading her to get engaged to her son. The neighbor even buys the girl's family's property, bit by bit. Yeah, I decided to turn my story with Norman into a short drama. Since this genre was still pretty new and the content was half true and half made up, it blew up online. The man is such a jerk. His wife works so hard every day, and all he does is eat and drink, dreaming of becoming a singer. What kind of singer spends all day just talking? Even after being reborn, he still pesters the girl he failed to pursue. How shameless. If I had a son like that, I'd rather strangle him. His parents are no better. They're all good for nothing. The comments were flying in, and the small blogger in charge of the video became an overnight sensation, gaining millions of followers. I made sure to arrange a bunch of ads for her, and she made a small fortune. Of course, Norman wasn't going to let me off that easily. He started spreading nasty rumors about me online, trying to make our relationship sound all kinds of wrong. Some gross guys even believed it and joined in with the insults. Not on my watch. I sent lawyers' letters to every single one of them. I mean, with our two lives being so different, the whole reborn thing is so out there that no one would really believe those rumors, right? Norman got caught pretty quick. His posts had been shared over 30,000 times, and he even paid for a team of online trolls to make it worse. He totally dug his own grave. The Lee family was desperate, trying to find our contact info, but no luck there. Meanwhile, Norman's company in Beijing also sued him. He broke company rules by leaving without permission and doing some seriously messed up stuff. When I heard about it, I was honestly surprised. It seemed Norman had a knack for attracting attention, but for all the wrong reasons. Norman reached out through someone, begging me to help him get a good lawyer. He promised he'd pay me back once he got out. Pay me back? More like get revenge, I thought. I made sure he got the boot, sending a message back, "Dream on." While I could choose to leave the past behind and not get revenge, that didn't mean I was just going to let it go. I wanted to see Norman's life fall apart and watch my once caring in laws run around trying to fix things for him. I put on my sunglasses and headed to the company. The right path in life, the right way to go. My life would shine bright and be full of awesomeness. When Norman was arrested, he was totally out of it. Faced with the police, he wanted to argue, but he didn't know what to say. In the end, he just said that he and I were husband and wife. Yeah, we were husband and wife. His mom always said that. A couple, but the husband was the boss. I, a lonely orphan, should be happy he even picked me. At one point, Norman thought I was okay, obedient, understanding, and easily flustered. But then Ondine showed up, and the red rose reignited all of Norman's teenage dreams. I had always been too boring for him. After we got married, Norman heard that Ondine had gone back to Beijing, was in college, and even dated a famous singer. The day they went public, it was all over the internet. Norman was jealous. If he had followed his dream, would he have been with Ondine instead of that singer? So he started to hate me, the one who stopped him from chasing his dreams. If it wasn't for me, his parents wouldn't have died, and he wouldn't have been forced to marry me. It was all my fault. If he hadn't forced me into marriage, maybe he would have still had a chance to chase his dreams. For 20 years, Norman tortured me, happy when I got angry, thinking it was his punishment. He even told our kids I was a bad mom, and they turned against me. But he didn't expect a second chance. He didn't realize how different his reborn life would be from what he imagined. He was tired now. He even started to miss the days when I took care of him. When he heard I had money, he thought we could get back together. Maybe I could make it big with April's money, he thought. But that dream ended when he was arrested. Even worse, his company was involved. When he found out about the fines and jail time, he panicked. No, this wasn't right. His life shouldn't be like this. Could he get another chance? In prison, as his brightly dyed hair was shaved off, he looked at his reflection, closed his eyes, and a tear fell, and he regretted it. Could he have a do-over?